The pleasure of being the moderator for this event this afternoon, and we're going to begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, and we have a veteran with us who's going to lead the Pledge of Allegiance. So will you please stand?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, before we get started, just a couple of ground rules. First of all, if you haven't done so already, would you please silence your cell phones? Thank you. I want to just talk about a couple of basic ground rules. What will happen is, in just a moment, when we begin, I will draw names. I will draw a name from the blue box, and if you haven't done so already and you want to ask a question, make sure that your name and address or name and city gets in the box. I will draw those names randomly from the question bin. If your name is called, then Helen, raise your hand. Helen, who has a microphone, will find you as you stand up. You will ask your question, and then Congressman Paulsen will answer the question, and then we'll move to the next question. We'll try to get through as many questions as we possibly can, so we ask that your question be brief and concise. We also ask that at all times you remain respectful of one another so that whoever is asking the question, that question can be heard. Now let's, I think with that, are we ready to begin?
Yeah.
All right, let me just get my box. Well, here it is. Right?
There's your box.
They moved it.
Yeah.
They moved it on me.
Your box is moved. You can hang out right there. So, first of all, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll just kick it off. Daddy, you're in charge of that. And I said earlier when we were at Hamel, I usually use the opportunity to give a little update on some of the things going on and the initiatives we're working on, in particular importance to me or to you. But I think it's just sort of best to dive into questions if you guys are good with that, because then we can get through more. Because an hour goes by fast. You'd be surprised how fast an hour can fly by. So with that, thanks for being here and just sharing some insight, thoughts, perspectives, asking a question, and then we'll just go into it. So with that, you guys start off.
Here we go. Michelle Abbott from Orono. Michelle, would you stand? And Helen will find you. There you go.
The lottery winner. All right.
Thanks for that. Good afternoon. I think that the measure of a society is how we take care of our most vulnerable members. In the Republican Congress, you've put through a significant tax cut for the wealthy. At the same time, the social services for our vulnerable members are being cut in an effort to, worry about the budget. Things like health care, food stamps, all of those things. So I want to know, as my congressman, what legislation you are willing to sponsor or at a minimum vote for that would protect the vulnerable members and keep their benefits for them.
Okay, well, a couple things, and maybe it's a pretty broad question. So first, in terms of protecting the vulnerable, and many of you may know that I became very involved in an issue of human trafficking and missing children a few years ago. And it's not just having 4 daughters, right? That sort of got me paying attention to this, but it was the fact that I had met with a lot of young victims. I'll call them victims because they're 12, 13-year-old girls primarily. And I interacted with Senator Klobuchar, who has been a prosecutor in this space too. And then we teamed up after the Star Tribune series and actually got legislation moving to give safe harbor, things like that. So that's sort of on, doing some things that are very important for protecting missing children, vulnerable victims, et cetera, in the area of trafficking. I'll disagree a little bit on the tax cut side because that's mostly geared towards middle income, lower income folks. That's where most of the benefits go. Statistically, 56% of all tax benefits actually are going to those families making under $200,000. In fact, those who make $1 million or more actually have an increased share of what they will pay under the new system. So there's absolutely a need to do other reforms. You mentioned some other areas in healthcare, for instance. Now, I'm not aware of any specific cuts you may identify, but we've added more money to the Children's Health Insurance Program for the longest period of time ever in the history of the program, actually, for I think it's 10 years now. So we've done some real good things that have made progress in that area. There's going to have to be more that needs to be done. So there's the Farm Bill is being debated. There's going to be more health care initiatives, obviously. But the best part, I think, on the tax reform side is everyone can participate in a growing competitive economy, which is really important, again, for young people that are getting out of school, don't necessarily have to live at home with their parents because they have more difficulty finding jobs. So the labor markets have improved, capital investment is up, wages are up, every economic indicator is up, and we can do a lot better than 2%, which is where we've been for the last 8 years, essentially in a row. So when you have 3.3% projected growth, it helps a growing competitive economy, helps young people. It also helps baby boomers and others who are preparing for retirement, rely on important government safety programs. That's actually really important too. So, and it's only been 4.5 months, and I think a lot of folks are really surprised at how positive the economic impact has been early from the tax overhaul. But I think the best positive impacts we're going to see are years to come, mostly on the international side, because it's been about keeping headquarters here, keeping jobs here, keeping innovation here, which had been departing over a period of time.
Vulnerable members who aren't affected by the tax cut, they're the ones who are counting on
Well,
services.
I know we don't have follow-up questions, but let me just do this. Let me just say this, is that most of the tax cut, again, geared towards families who are moderate and lower income folks. Child income credit is doubled, right? And so a lot of those folks have increased benefits. So they actually receive more money than they were before. So
Our next question comes from Chanhassen, Mary Schmid. Mary? She is? Helen?
Well, my name is Mary Schmidt, and thank you for letting me ask a question. And I'm pleased to be here this afternoon and to have gotten a ticket. Getting back to the vulnerable people, I'm concerned about the farm bill.
Okay.
And isn't that cutting a lot of the food stamps?
Yeah.
Am I wrong in that?
No.
There are some changes that are recommended as a part of the farm bill that was brought up in the House recently. Now, it hasn't passed yet, but I would say this, is that under the SNAP Supplemental Nutrition Benefit program that has been given in the past, and I've worked bipartisanly actually with the Minnesota colleague, Betty McCullen, where we've given more ability for those folks to use their own health, or their own dollars in that program, homebound seniors in particular, to go to grocery stores at Cub, et cetera. And so now I think the next phase is saying, well, we got 6.6 million jobs that are out there right now that are not being filled. Again, economy's doing better. One of the reforms that we've looked at are some work requirements for SNAP recipients, right? Keep in mind the last time that we had unemployment this low in the country, we had, it was like 17 million SNAP beneficiaries. Today it's like 43 million. So the work requirements have changed over time, and getting back to, and this is, obviously you care for the disabled, you care for folks that have young children, et cetera, and there's an age limit that would put people in the category of not losing any benefits, for instance, but making sure people have the dignity of wanting to work and helping save for their family, et cetera. So that's all part of that reform. But it's not solidified yet. Not solidified yet. That's still being discussed.
Thank you for your question. Next is Jerry Murkowski from Chanhassen. Jerry, would you stand, please? There you go.
Congressman, I'd like to thank you for your service. And my question is I'd like you to justify your vote on the Republican vote for the Medicare or medical, what was it? I'm sorry, I can't think of it. The repeal of the Obamacare. Let's just go at it that way and be brief. I'm an older person, as you can see, and I was very concerned with the cuts that were proposed for the Medicaid and Medicare program. My parents both had to go on Medicaid because they were both in homes where they needed service. My dad had a stroke, my mom had dementia. It took $300,000 out of their savings immediately. Had that program not been in place, they would have been thrown out.
The Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act, yes.
So Obamacare, Affordable Care. So here's my view on the Affordable Care, and no surprise here, right? So it improved access for some situations like that, but I would say it is actually hurt more people than it's helped. And I can't tell you how many folks, a lot of people don't like that. I can't tell you, that is by far the number one issue I have heard the most about in my tenure, without a doubt. And it's not even close of people who are upset with the program. It's not even close. But you have to remember, if you go back a year and a half, keep in mind in Minnesota, we were number 4 in the country for where our premiums were going up. I talk to a lot of cancer patients, widows, families, pastor families who essentially have had their lives destroyed, in essence, because of a one-size-fits-all approach. And so no Medicare changes were a part of Obamacare. Now, the original bill there were. They cut Medicare in the original Affordable Care Act. I mean, it did cut Medicare. So there were Medicaid changes, and I think states should have more control over their Medicaid dollars. I mean, look, Minnesota, as a state, can do really good things and has done with the disabled and, using those dollars as they best see fit. Again, not a one-size-fits-all. Now, some of those premium increases have been masked a little bit because our legislature stepped in and gave some resources, kind of a Band-Aid approach, but also did a reinsurance program, which I think other states should actually be doing as well, to sort of reinsure those folks that have had high deductibles, and really, you don't really have insurance, right? It's like you have an insurance card, but your deductible is so high, and this is, again, an issue for the vulnerable, but you essentially don't even have insurance, right? And that was one of the provisions that we've talked about with the individual mandate that got repealed, et cetera. So I know there's disagreement about that, but we really didn't address the cost issue at all in Obamacare. It was just access only, not cost. And we got to address the cost side if we're going to make progress to making sure that healthcare is going to be more affordable for people.
Thank you for your quiet respect for both the questioner and the congressman. Our next question comes from Chaska, Mitch Anderson. Mitch, would you stand up, please? Right here.
So, Congressman, let's try and have a reasonable conversation about guns, which is a tough topic. School shootings, shootings of people at concerts, shootings of people in nightclubs. General epidemic of gun violence seems to be a huge, huge problem. I don't see you taking a leadership position on any reasonable solutions that I would consider to be reasonable solutions, including universal background checks, limiting or eliminating access to assault-style weapons, high-capacity magazines. These are issues that the vast majority of Americans want to see enacted. Congress just can't seem to get behind any of it. I don't understand that.
Well, one of the challenges why you've seen Congress not getting behind some of those proposals is there's not agreement on those. What I've spent my time focusing on are some of the provisions that I hope we can make progress and get agreement on. And I've been a proponent of lifting, we used to have a federal ban on gun violence research, right? So the CDC and others have been prohibited because quite honestly, a lot of gun organizations felt that, well, if the government is allowing that research to take place, they'll only be advocating for gun control. But that ban was lifted just a few months ago as a part of that broader budget agreement, which I think is good. So if the government's doing basic research like they do on NIH or health, care or renewable energy, they can be doing the same on gun violence, and they make recommendations. So as policymakers, you can say, okay, well, we'll actually solve the problem. When the Las Vegas tragedy happened, it was this bump stock issue. No one ever heard of it. I didn't heard of bump stock, right? But you have weapons that are essentially illegal right now, and a device that would make a legal weapon illegal. I think that device should be illegal too. Now we haven't been able to pass that, right? So some gun groups are pushing back on it. But I think the most opportune issue, or the chance that we have to resolve this issue, are what are referred to as gun violence restraining orders. And only a couple of states have this provision where you're giving another tool to law enforcement. And this was a tip-off in the Parkland tragedy, and I've met with all these students, in our area, and they're scared, they're concerned, and they have real legitimate issues. No parent or no child should be afraid of going to school for some incident. And the way Orono handled their situation, really well. But Parkland didn't handle it very well, and I think giving more tools to law enforcement to handle it with these gun violence restraining orders is the way, move in the right direction. And we got some bipartisan support. There were 5 of us that just did this press conference around 2.5 weeks ago. And in fact, even the co-author of the bill with me is Ted Deutsch, who represents Parkland. And so it essentially says, look, if you as a family member, you see something that maybe your relative, or you're hearing something that your son or daughter has said, like the tips that went into Parkland, come across on social media, whatever, that they may be a threat to themselves, they may be a threat to others, it would allow law enforcement to step in and to take away the weapons in that situation. You've got due process in place, you've got probable cause in place. It's worked in states like Indiana, a very Republican state that passed this under a tragedy, unfortunately. And I think we should be doing that at the federal level and having the states do that. And I think Minnesota may have debated this in the legislature. But again, realize that some gun groups oppose it because they feel it may lead to the road of confiscation on things. But I think with some of the bipartisan support we have, there's some progress on it. I think that's sort of our best hope on that. Oh, by the way, I should mention, you mentioned background checks. So if you remember the incident that happened in Texas, actually, there was a shooting in the church where the Air Force person was discharged dishonorably, had domestic abuse. None of that information was reported into the background check system. Your background check system is only as good as the information that's in it. And so we were able to fix that in that background check system and actually get that put in place. I'm okay with more background checks, in terms of making progress in that area, but we were able to get that across the finish line too. So 2 things done. I think one more key provision could be done and should be done to prevent another tragedy. And by the way, it's also about preventing suicide. It's not just preventing a tragedy, but it's preventing suicide. It's worked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in these states.
All right. Just a reminder to keep your question brief and concise so the congressman can answer the question. Next is from Edina, Mary Jo Straub. Mary Jo?
Yes, I'm right.
There we go. Thank you.
Yes, well, I guess one of the main questions I have, so I've been here, I've lived in Edina for about 40 years, and I've tried desperately to talk to you, to meet you. This is the first time I have ever met you, even though I've tried repeatedly. So if this is working so well for you, why haven't you done this before?
So, I'm just curious, so when you said you've tried to meet with me, have you called the office?
Oh, repeatedly.
Yeah, because as folks probably know, I'm one of the only members of Congress that does open office hours and meets with essentially almost anyone. And I see some familiar faces in here. So those conversations are really good. And I understand you may disagree or have disagreements, but listening and getting the perspective is always helpful. So
why haven't you done this before?
Well, I do a variety of outreach meetings. So I've done the teletown hall meetings since I was first elected, right? Now I'm just going to tell you those are way more popular, wildly popular. In fact, just last week I had people telling me, don't do the regular town hall meetings because I'm not going to get my voice heard. It ends up being a spectacle. I understand that, but I thought, no, it's good. We'll do some of those. So I've always used those. You reach more people. There's more variety. People appreciate them more. And it uses technology. Younger people like them too. So that's just the reality. Secondly, the Congress on Your Corner events, which are more small, mini-session town hall meetings, a lot of one-on-one connections with people. People enjoy those conversations. But if you call the office and just ask for Anna, we'll set something up. That's not a problem.
I've been spoken very rudely by your office member.
Well, I don't believe that, but
Our next question from Eden Prairie, Tina Cruz. I think I'm saying that right, Tina? All right, Tina Cruz.
Paulsen, thank you so much for hosting us and for your service. I am here primarily concerned about gun sense, and I'm glad that question has been addressed. My follow-up question will be about your receipt of NRA money, as well as other special interest groups, big pharmacy, big oil. From my understanding, there's been quite a number of dollars, and I'm really concerned about your campaign financing, and I hope you'll speak to your decision about what to take and what not to.
Sure. So big pharma, big oil. I don't know what that has to do with guns, but anyway, good to share your view there. Look, I have a lot of folks that support me and support my policies that I work on across the board. In fact, a lot of those groups may not like some of the positions I have even proposed lately. Some of the gun groups, for instance, have concern about the gun violence restraining orders. So I always just do what's right for the community, right for the district, and that's how I vote. And I think the bottom line is I think Minnesotans appreciate and they like that approach, and that's just what I continue to do. A big part of it is also, this is part of being a Minnesotan, and you can joke about it where you're Minnesota nice, but I think because our delegation gets along so well together, it's enabled us to work on some initiatives that have been important to the state. We got some room, I think, on some of the on the healthcare initiatives because we got some space on. We talk about drugs and pharmaceutical prices, having more generics, for instance, available in the market, making sure this rule is lifted so that pharmacists are able to talk to for the prescription buyer, are actually able to talk to them about a cash option, maybe not under insurance, that may be cheaper for the patient, might be a better way to go. Now, some interests may oppose that, but I think we should be looking into having a policy change to make that happen. Because I think you should have the right to know if there's a better alternative for your pocketbook and get the same result. You should be able to do that. So again, that doesn't influence me one iota.
Next for Eden Prairie is, I think, is it Kern or Kevin Knudsen? Kern Knudsen? Kern, all right, there you go.
I want to thank you for having this meeting today. I own an accounting firm with a couple employees, and our tax software this year will show the difference under the old tax law and the new tax law.
Okay.
So I have clients that are making $400,000 a year, and they're getting back $10,000, $15,000 under the new tax law. I have a single mother whose husband died, and she makes $50,000 and has 2 kids in college, and she's going to owe $2,000 more under the new tax law. So it seems very inequitable. In me, I'm going to get a huge tax cut. I don't need it, and my kids are going to have to pay for that because the tax law was not funded. So what you're saying, a lot of the people are getting back $500 to $1,000 a year, which is very minimal. But the people making $300,000, $400,000, the tax software is showing them getting back $10,000 to $15,000.
Yeah.
So who's going to pay for this law? And I want to know about the inequities.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, so keep in mind 75% of the tax overhaul or tax cuts go to families and small business. So 25% is on the corporate side, where the corporate rate went down to 21%. That's 25% of it. The 75% is for small business and families, right? And a lot of small businesses file under the individual rates as well, right? And you know that, right?
But I don't need that tax cut.
Well, I'm just telling you, I mean, I can't tell you how many small businesses I have talked to who have said, thank you for letting me keep more of my own money, because now I'm going to hire more people. I'm actually going to train and educate some of my employees at a daycare that I visited recently. And so, again, every economic indicator shows moving the positive direction on the growth side, and that's where the benefits are. Now, it's different for every situation, right? I mean, alternative minimum tax is repealed, for instance, so a lot of folks in our area get the benefit of that, right? Someone told me, a family told me they were going to benefit from that, but that's been capturing more and more middle class income folks for a long period of time.
Next from Eden Prairie is Angela Sovic. Angela?
Yeah, like everybody else said, thank you so much for holding this town hall. My question for you has to do with immigration and refugees, and what sorts of measures and actions are you willing to support to help protect the immigrants and refugees, and to help keep immigrant and refugee families together so they aren't separated?
Yeah, so this is an area I think is really important in Minnesota. Again, as someone who's been an advocate for the tax reform policies for growing the economy, right? Well, if you have a growing economy, you have to have labor following capital to fill in the jobs, right? A big part of that is not only getting people off the sidelines that have been on the sidelines, quite honestly, the last 8-9 years, where the labor participation rate has gone down to historical low levels. It's also having immigration fill in the pipeline. And I can't tell you how many employers I've spoken to who rely on immigrants to do work, that they can't find folks to do that work. We should be making it easier for either high-skilled or low-skilled workers to be coming here. And so it's one of the reasons why, and I think part of the problem that Washington or Congress has had over the last decade is that they've always said, oh, comprehensive solutions are always the magic answer. Well, when you ask for the comprehensive solution, there's always going to be a group on the right and the left that polarize it and prevent it from moving forward. And that's what's happened on immigration. But we do have a chance to fix DACA. For those of you that aren't familiar, it's this Deferred Action for Children program that essentially deals with all of these young kids who have come to the United States through no fault of their own. And I will just tell you, for all practical purposes, these are America's children. They speak no other language. They speak English. I've met with many of them personally. They help themselves better their own family situation, going to college. For one woman I spoke to who's now caring for her siblings upcoming. And those are the people we should be encouraging to stay here, and be long-term productive, contributors to our society. And so it was just last week, and this is opposite of where my leadership was, because I've been frustrated where they haven't brought some immigration proposals to the table. I signed on to a discharge petition that'll say, hey, we should have a vote on 3 or 4 of these different things. We don't know what the outcome of that vote will be. The Republicans can have their most conservative approach. The Democrats can have their most liberal approach. I'm guessing neither one of those would pass. But there's also, under that scenario, a situation where you would have a middle of the road. You can have border security in exchange for fixing DACA, as an example. And so that's why I signed on, because I'm convinced there's a governing majority of folks that would do the right thing, or support that type of policy. And I have to mention this also, because this is sort of uniquely Minnesotan. I think of the Liberian community, right? And I know these folks really well. I play soccer with them on the weekends, and they're mostly living in Brooklyn Park and Champlin and Brooklyn Center. And these are hardworking people. They came to the United States, decades ago in a civil war, an Ebola crisis, et cetera. They'll work 3 jobs, for their families. And they have had annual or biannual situations where they have had their status threatened. And it was under Bush, it was under Obama, and it was under Trump. And so I led a letter, and we were successful, a lot of Minnesotans signed on and others, to extend that program again for them. It gives them a little bit more peace of mind for the short term. We still need the long-term solution, right? Because when it ends again in a year, what'll happen? That'll be the fear. So that's caring for refugees, as well as, I think, honestly addressing some legitimate issues we have within our economy to grow and be stronger. Yeah.
For Minnetonka, Pat Ridgely. Pat, are you here? Pat, you want to stand up? Get a microphone, please.
I'm concerned about the threats to the independence of the special counsel's investigation on the campaigns last year, and also with regard to the independence of the FBI. And I'm not saying that these are completely under the jurisdiction of the House, but I'd be interested in your assessment of that and where you think it might go.
Yeah, so, first of all, my view has always been Russia is not our friend in any way whatsoever. I'll just tell you, they have been known to not only subvert, as every intelligence agency would say, our election process going back to last year, but also Europeans, Eastern Europeans joining with the Western Europeans. I've seen it in my trade work where they've scuttled some opportunity for progress where Russia tries to keep Ukraine over, for instance. So, they're not. They're very disingenuous, right? And if we're going to believe in the competence and the integrity of our election system, we have to acknowledge, one, that is taking place. Two, look, I support the special counsel continuing his role in finality, and it should not be interrupted, and it should be completed. And some of my colleagues have gotten into the debate a little bit about finishing it up and concluding it and being done, and there have been some frustrations within some of the FBI components, but I think those are separate from the Mueller investigation. And now, I can't remember his name, was the last gentleman who was acknowledged by the Inspector General to be not forthright or not honest in some of his answers. So, when you have a law enforcement official lying, that's a problem, obviously. So, and that was an Obama appointee who said that had happened. So there are some issues there, and those should be called out, but I think that is separate from the investigation itself under the special counsel. And I think, and I said this early on, and I had some Republicans push back on me, but it was about a year ago, when the FBI director was fired, to me, it made sense that your neutral law enforcement arbitrator is the FBI. When that firing took place, then you should have a special counsel put in place, and obviously you hope goes on and on forever. But I think that should be able to be complete. Well, I do. I think it will.
Next, from Minnetonka, I think it's Alan Winter. Alan Winter. Over here, Alan.
Good afternoon. Well, much of my question has already been raised, so let me ask it this way. I go on your website, and you have a drop-down box, and it lists about 24 topics. None of those mention school safety or gun safety. And since you have been working with some bipartisan support for some efforts in that area, what I'd like to know is, do you consider those subjects priority issues for you in this election year? And if you do, what will you do in Congress to garner other congressional support for more action on school safety and gun violence?
Yeah, I to be honest, I haven't even looked at my website, so I don't know what's on there and not there. But
That's too bad.
when I do the weekly video conversations where people ask questions, I've got a lot of folks ask about gun violence, and I've responded to those, and we post those. Those are all posted on. I know those are posted on there. Those are on social media immediately. So those are front and center. You know, we haven't ignored that. In fact, we've taken it head on because we think it's important to have that type of conversation. So, what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry. I didn't, at the end.
Well, I just, if those are priorities for
Oh,
you,
yeah.
how will you garner congressional action?
Well, I mean, as an example, and sometimes it's hard to get bipartisan support for initiatives because, you know, look, I got some of my colleagues who are Republicans who say, I'm only going to sign on to bills if they're Republicans that are authors. Or I got Democrats who say, I'm only going to sign on to bills if there are Democrats authoring them. I mean, my approach is totally different. So I am number 3 in the whole House out of 435 members for having the most bipartisan co-authors of my bills. All right? Now, I'm just telling you, that approach as a legislator, you know, is a way to get things across the finish line. And, you know, even when President Obama was president his last term, I was one of only 34 members in the entire Congress that passed something into law because things grind to a halt in the election year. So that's just a different approach that I use. So when I did the press conference with Ted Deutsch and 3 others on the gun violence restraining order issue, that signals to our colleagues, hey, we want to, you know, have a conversation. It signals to leadership. We want to have a conversation about it. We want to get this moving and get a bill, a hearing in committee, you know. And I think part of it too is when your bill when you think it's a good idea, I actually bring it down on the House floor and shop it around, right? If it's a good idea, you want it to be an idea that both sides support, right? Because the pendulum always swings and different people are in charge. And so that's just my approach. And some people don't agree with that approach. I think it yields positive results over the long term. Because some of the things like in human trafficking we talked about earlier, we did that stuff in a hurry. I mean, because it was recognized this was a problem. As people became educated, we were on top of it. But even the medical device tax, which was a new tax that started in Obamacare, you know, I mean, that was killing jobs. I mean, it was a big deal at hurting Minnesota. But it took 5 years before we even could get it moving forward to actually realize, oh yeah, we got enough bipartisan support to actually override a presidential veto. And so then we got it done. And so now we're still in a suspension mode of that tax. Yeah.
From Chanhassen, Sally Johnson. Sally, are you here? There she is.
Hi. I've heard that you're concerned about Dean Phillips having millions of dollars to contribute towards his own campaign. And I'm wondering if you're aware that if you signed the Minnesota Way, that would eliminate that problem for you?
Well, I'm not exactly familiar with the Minnesota Way. Now, I know that and we have to make sure we don't have this is an official event, so we're not going to get into the campaign stuff. But you're referring to, I think, maybe a challenge that has been made by my opponent, but some of these challenges have been made in the past as well that would prevent outside money from coming in to be an influence. And some candidates have used that effectively in certain states. And I've supported that in the past. So my challenge now is, you mentioned with an opponent who inherited millions of dollars, that he can spend that money. Now, that campaign pledge would not prohibit him from doing that, though, under that Minnesota Way. So keep in mind.
You just said you weren't familiar with
So, but that's the only, keep in mind, so.
All right, next from Victoria, Vince Baudette.
Right over there.
Thank you. Oh, you're going to hold
I got
that.
it, I got it.
Congressman Licensure, thanks for coming out and thanks for getting us access to you. Going back to 1980, we put Ronald Reagan, or 81, he put in place the famous Reagan tax cuts. They were significant tax cuts for both business and individuals. And as a result, the net growth of the economy, the GDP itself grew, it doubled. The government, that is the government take, the tax take of the federal government actually doubled. In other words, by the 90s, or by 1990, the federal government had twice the amount of money due to all of the extra economic activity as a result of those cuts. What do you project for the tax cuts? And thank you for signing off on them, incidentally. What do you project for the tax cuts for that occurred this last year, 2017? What kind of growth? And also jobs, if you could comment on that. Jobs, and more jobs, which certainly is what I'm all about.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. And I would say this. So, you know, when the tax code is overhauled once every generation. And that's what it was, 31 years since Ronald Reagan, right? 1986. I mean, that's a long time. Huey Lewis and the News were burning up the charts. Top Gun was the top of it. That's a long time ago. Kids don't even know what that is today. But these kids do know that when they're graduating from college, they got a lot of debt. It's tougher to find a job. That's changing now for the first time, where we now have seen, even the Congressional Budget Office has acknowledged we will have 3.3% growth by the end of the year, which is way higher than they ever acknowledged in the last 8-9 years, where we could never do better than 2%. And so revenues are coming in stronger. Unemployment, jobless claims are at the lowest they've been in 50 years. Unemployment rate itself is the lowest now since it was since, I think, year 2000, right? And business and optimism, by the way, among workers and everyone else is enthusiastic. So I'm pretty bullish for where this can go. We obviously have to focus on the spending side of the ledger as well. And this is the challenge that both parties have dug some holes in the past. But as a share of our gross domestic product, we're in a better position now to address those situations than we were if we had not done the tax overhaul. And that's what's really important for the long term.
Next from Bloomington, Noah Wheeler. Noah, would you stand up? There we go. Back, Helen.
Hi, thank you for having me today. I'll keep it short. Just to go off the tax reform that we were talking about, could you explain in more detail the opportunity zones?
So this is like a little more inside, I don't want to say inside baseball, but it's a provision that states are really excited about that have not been highlighted very much, opportunity zones. So it essentially would help distressed areas in poverty. And in essence, it helps a lot of our most vulnerable areas. So Governor Dayton is fired up about it because he has to recommend where those opportunity zones are going to be. It essentially says, if you've got areas that have more poverty than other areas, what can we do to capture some long-term capital gains that people have been using, put those in funds that can invest only in those distressed areas. And there's been more and more attention on this lately by economists, by people on both sides of the aisle. I think all 50 states now have identified their zones. We have a couple in the 3rd district, in Coon Rapids in particular, and I can't remember where the others are. Minneapolis obviously would have some. And so it's about giving more assets and equity for the long term for a development. It's not just go in for a short period of time and then withdraw. It's like empowerment zones, or some things could be, for instance, that have been tried along this scale. But it is to actually put long-term systemic infrastructure in place, not just fast food restaurants, things like that, but long-term growth that actually help opportunity for everyone, and especially in those distressed areas. So I think we're going to be hearing more about that because every governor is pushing hard for this now implementation to happen. So you're going to be hearing more about it.
All right, Minnetonka. I hope I'm saying this right. Is it Karin Abdalal?
Perfect.
Who said that to me? Who said that to me? Exactly.
Well, I have my list of 13 questions, so but I'll only pick one.
Pick the best one, Karin.
Yeah, I'll pick the best one. You mentioned a couple questions ago that law enforcement shouldn't lie. I think we all heard that. Unfortunately, it's well known that we have a president who likes to fabricate information off the top of his head or twist the truth. I mean, this is not something I'm making up, but this is well known. We know that he supports white nationalism, makes racist statements about colleagues, and basically, in my opinion, he holds the good of the Trump organization above the good of the United States. So my question is, why don't you publicly and adamantly denounce such behavior? Because most of us see things for what they really are, and we know when we hear a lie, we're not deceived. We'd like you to stand up and speak out against this.
Yeah, well, I have. In fact, again, and I don't respond to everything that the president tweets or whatever. I want every president to succeed, as I did with President Obama or the President Trump, and I want our country to succeed, right? And a lot of the policies that I support, and I don't agree with them all, but if I don't support it, and I've got some differences on some immigration and some trade, but I'm excited about where the economy is going on the regulatory front and on the tax front. But on the white nationalism thing, I mean, I remember this incident that happened, I think it was last August. I'm trying to remember back, where there was an incident in one of the Carolinas, and again, there was back and forth, and I heard there were tweets and stuff. So I did respond to that and said, that's inexcusable. President should apologize, whatever it was at that time. But no, so I have spoken out. I'm not going to respond to everything because that's not my job to do. But I do think everyone should share with their elected officials where they stand on their own policies. So if the president says something you don't agree, you got to let him know, and they get just as much mail or more, I would think, than I do. So
It's not disagree, it's not believe.
So
From Eden Prairie, this is an easy one. David Anderson. One of the 3 most popular names in Minnesota. David's pretty good
That's
too.
not my real name, but I put it so you can pronounce it. I have a question, but I just want to go on record. I taught school for 40 years, and very good. And the person or persons who came up with the idea of arming teachers should seek professional help. I'm going to pick one of my questions. You've kind of touched on it, but this is important to me, my family, and my friends. I looked into some things, and it comes out that you've taken more money from special interest groups than almost any other member of Congress, over $8 million in the last 10 years. Yet in 2001, you said that even the appearance of special interest influence was enough to justify campaign finance reform. Why has your position and perspective changed so much?
Yeah. Well, we had this question too in Hamel where we just were actually. So 2001, that reference was when I was in the state legislature, right? And I didn't take any PAC money even back then. But keep in mind, since that time frame, we had a Supreme Court decision, right, that ruled that free speech is allowed and available for every organization, and that money to be there to have that influence. So you may not like it, but that's a Supreme Court decision, and that's in the end, that's the law of the land. I would just say this, is that again, I'm not beholden to anyone. If there's a policy that I don't agree with, I push ahead on it anyway, regardless of where I've gotten support or the viewpoints that may be expressed strongly. But why should realtors, and maybe realtors in this room, who want to advocate for their personal initiatives and come and meet with me, why should accountants who belong to the Minnesota CPAs be able to have their free speech limited? I don't think they should.
Money isn't
And so, that's part of it. Again, I don't have the ability to, I don't think we should go to a situation where people are self-funding and funding their own races. I think you should have to have an opportunity to raise support from the public and from supporters, and then obviously have opponent against opponent. I definitely have issues with outside money coming in and distorting and all that sort. We've seen that happen. That's happened year after year after year in Minnesota and other states.
Next question is from Chanhassen. Mary Ellen Seeley.
It's me. I'm a mom. I probably don't need the money. Anyway, I'm kidding. I wonder if you would spend a moment, Congressman, talking about trade. It seems like the market gets jittery every time China is brought up. I feel whiplashed watching the news each night, listening to what the president's position is on a day-to-day basis. What do you think? Where should we be?
So I spent a lot of time on this, and in fact, recently when the Vice Premier of China was in town in Washington, he met with 7 of us, and they requested to meet with some of the leaders on trade in Congress. First time that's ever been done. So the administration was a little miffed that they were meeting with the congressional folks before they were meeting with the administration. But I am a strong believer in a robust trade agenda. I think my viewpoint is that we should be selling American goods and services at every opportunity. And it's one of the reasons why Minnesota has survived the economic storm much better than a lot of other states. We export a lot of high-valued manufacturing in particular. A lot of medical devices now. For the first time, by the way, medical devices are being written into trade treaties because it's about improving healthcare outcomes around the world and then keeping jobs here in Minnesota. So I'm concerned about just blanket tariffs that get put on, like steel and aluminum. And I understand some of the challenges that have been there over the years, but when you do that on a broad-based a broad level, that can backfire in a hurry. And it can have a negative consequence on the economy, quite honestly, or in the markets, as I think that's been jitteriness you mentioned. So I see that happening. So I don't think that's a surprise. I'd rather have a strategy to address China's forced transfer of intellectual property, and they do force it. I talked to companies that do it. We had a company from Minnesota testify out in Washington a week ago about that, but he doesn't support the broad tariff policy because he thinks that's actually could backfire. And they steal intellectual property, and they also have all these rules and regulations behind the scenes where they essentially are prohibiting Americans from coming in and selling their stuff, and other countries, by the way, too. I think our best avenue against China is to have a united front with our allies and with others. And I think we make it more difficult with our allies when we have a steel and aluminum tariff that hits our allies. You know what I mean? So that's where I think it's sort of counterintuitive, where we're not, the strategy isn't sort of being worked in an appropriate way for the end result. That's my concern. I mean, I could talk about trade all day. I don't want to occupy it, but all the time in that. But that's my general philosophy. And I think it's a mistake where we've gone on some of these things. And by the way, with medical devices, I led a letter with some of my colleagues because part of the president's target, where he wants to do targets on tariffs on Chinese products, are medical devices that get brought over to the United States, and then actually it goes back and forth in the supply chain. So we're actually kind of hurting our own American jobs on that. So I'm worried about that. But they may not fully understand that. And that's what we're trying to sort of get across to them, is that, hey, this is actually a deeper issue than just a simple quick fix.
All right, just a time check. We got about 15 minutes. I'm going to try to get through as many of these questions as we can. Next is from Plymouth, Jerry Kegler. Jerry, are you here? Jerry, standing right there.
Hi, candidate Trump and other Republicans talked a lot about infrastructure, and I'm just wondering what you think, or the Republican caucus thinks about that right now. It just seems like there's such an opportunity for cross-party energy and resources for that.
Yeah, and real quick, what do you think? I mean, you're talking about transportation, like okay, all right, just to get a sense.
Bridges, roads,
airports, transportation,
roads, airports.
Got it. Okay. I actually thought that when the tax debate was going on, and the tax overhaul was going on, that there would be a tendency or a natural inclination to go in the direction of, okay, we're doing a tax overhaul. Part of that reform was actually allowing U.S. earnings to get back to the United States. There've been like a couple $1 trillion trapped overseas, and get it back here. Most of that money all essentially got plowed into tax reform instead of infrastructure. But I thought the administration, because the president is a builder, would want to build things, right? And it actually would have moved us in the direction of fulfilling an infrastructure need that is out there. It is out there. It's a big part of our economy to move goods and services when the economy is doing better also. Call was made, that wasn't done. So there's no easy answer right now. So now the infrastructure packages have been broken up into separate parts. So nobody wants a gas tax, that supports that essentially, to actually pass it. And we're doing the FAA and airport stuff separately. We're doing, I think, the cargo on our canals and WRDA, it's called, Water Resources Infrastructure, separately. That's pretty much all bipartisanly supported. But where the rubber meets the road is that, yeah, you need more money in infrastructure. But to be honest, saying you have a $1.5 trillion need, or you want to do that, and by the way, our state and our locals are going to pay for most of that, and because it's only $200 billion is what the administration would want to put into the federal side of it, you're just not going to see the results. And again, there's not an easy answer there, but I do think we should be looking at some alternative components of, maybe it's not just gas tax, maybe it's something else. I don't know what that might be. I'm not a big fan of doing miles driven or GPSing you and government having all that information. We see the problems on the privacy side with others, but those issues I think are going to get debated and talked about as an alternative fuel method or revenue method.
Okay, now our next question. It says they live in net neutrality, but I think that's the question. The person is Terrill. Is it Terrill Turner? Terrill Turner. Right here.
Well, yeah, I apologize for that. My question is, I'm a small business owner. I have 15 employees, and I have to say I disagree with some of the comments you made about who really benefited from the tax cut that was passed by Congress recently. Sure. But having said that, my question today is, as a small business owner, my business strategy relies on my ability in those cases where I'm making large purchases to be able to negotiate discounts for repeated purchases, large purchases. I understand that you are also a small business owner. And I guess I'm wondering why it is that you oppose the efforts for Medicare to negotiate lower prescription drug prices. You know, it's over the last 10 years of your term in Congress, the drug prices have basically skyrocketed. And, you know, it's hurting your constituents, it's hurting the middle class, it's hurting vets, seniors, it's hurting everyone. And the big complaint is, you know, the safety net programs, there's all cost element, all has to do with, you know, healthcare. And healthcare, drug prices are a big component of that cost. And it's just, for Medicare, the largest purchaser of prescription drugs on the planet, not having the ability to negotiate those prices, it just defies common sense.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. You know, even the president's talked about wanting to go in that direction and do that. Look, one of the, I think I mentioned it earlier too, and by the way, as a small business owner, thanks for all the challenges you have to go through, because small business is the engine of the economy, and healthcare costs have been particularly hard on small businesses, especially sort of that one-size-fits-all approach, which hasn't worked so well for everybody. But I would say this, generics are important, right? Generic, you can do more to get generics coming to market. So that's FDA approval process, and there is some headway being made there. The pipeline had been backed up for a long period of time, and you have this gaming going on where some patents come off, for instance, off a patent, and then they go back on when someone else buys it, right? But getting generics in the market is one answer. Now, on the negotiation side of it, I'm not a fan of it, but part of it is because CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, again, nonpartisan, they have said it would do nothing to alter drug prices. They've said that. Now, you will limit what will be available in drugs. I mean, the VA has a really good system in place, but they do have less access to as many drugs as you do under Medicare. You don't get as much access. So that's part of the challenge. You know, do you sort of price control it, where you go in a direction where you're sort of picking and choosing what might be available, or do you want more innovation? Now, that doesn't mean there should.
Why do you oppose those efforts?
Well, again, my opposition would be just to say you shouldn't be limited if you're a senior to having more drug opportunities, you know, that might be good for your condition, or if it's not going to actually lower costs, then why do it, right? Because CBO says it's not going to affect the price at all. And that's our referee. That's our referee.
Well,
so.
Okay, let's go to the next question.
And we can follow up
as
after,
many as
so.
we can. From Eden Prairie, Joseph Steffen. Joseph, you here? There we go.
Welcome, thank you. I have no doubt that if net neutrality continues to be struck down by the FCC, the end user cost will skyrocket. Where do you stand on Congress passing laws to return net neutrality going forward?
Yeah, so and a lot of people aren't familiar with this concept of net neutrality. So my view is that you shouldn't have blocking, you shouldn't have throttling, and the preference would be is that we put it in the law, because, you know, the last administration did some things through administrative rule making. We saw a decline in internet investment. The new administration came in, they essentially just reversed it, right? So now it's sort of like a question mark, well, what's going to happen in a couple of years again? And I think it would be better just to put this into law and just say you're not allowed to block certain lanes, you're not allowed to throttle people into certain lanes, and have that availability. You know, I mean, that's just my general view. And also apply this stuff to everybody, because you have a battle right now that goes on between the Facebooks and the Googles of the world that want to only do things to, like internet service providers, and internet service providers only want to do things to the, you know, Google and Facebook. But, you know, it should be good for everybody is sort of my, you know, what's good for some are good for everybody, especially in the wake of some of the privacy issues and things that are kind of going on, you know what I mean? So that, I'm not confident that's going to move forward. There may be some proposals that move forward, but I think it should be done in statute as opposed to administratively. And I've talked to a lot of small companies that rely, or will and want to be able to rely, and know they have to rely on that type of access, especially new healthcare startups, as an example, that need that behind them.
Next from Shorewood, Suzanne, is it Cossette?
Yep.
Suzanne Cossette.
I'm going to go back to kids in school and guns again, sorry. More citizens, mostly children, have been killed in school shootings than U.S. military combatants this year. Knowing, even with that statistic, that a service person is 40 times more likely to be killed in combat than a child in their school, I find that an unacceptable statistic. So clearly people who should not have access to guns do have access to guns. Countries with much stricter background checks don't seem to have nearly the problem we have. And so would you commit to helping pass legislation for comprehensive, no loophole background checks and outlawing possession of assault rifles?
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, what was the last part? I missed the last.
Assault rifles, outlawing possession of assault rifles.
Oh, outlawing. Well, first of all, I agree with you, particularly on preventing folks that shouldn't have them from accessing them. I mean, that's been where a lot of the tragedies have come from, is from mental health issues, and that's been pretty clear. And I think that gun violence restraining order concept goes a long way to addressing that. And you're not gonna be able to fix everything. It's a very complex issue. I mean, it really is. And part of the challenge is too is that, you know, Second Amendment rights are important, right? Now, no right is absolute, where you can't have some, you know, restrictions. Obviously, that's been proven time and again in the courts. So I don't have a problem with enhancing some of the background checks. I think it's okay to have an additional waiting period if you're buying your gun at a gun show, for instance, right? But I do, and we had the one fix, as I mentioned. I think I mentioned it earlier regarding the dishonorable discharge and domestic violence issues. Put that in the background checks, and we mandated that that's in there now, because your system's only as good as the background info you have. So that, again, I think that'll go a long way to do it. On the assault rifle thing. The challenge is here. There was an assault rifle ban at one point. I can't remember what year it ended, but it ended, and there was no statistical change, you know, in the violence that was over that period of time. So that's where I think the CDC, that's where I think that's where I think the research that is now allowed can be very helpful. You know, I mean, because you want to actually pass something that's going to make a difference, right, or you know, have an impact. And so that's where I think the research side can be helpful.
Will you fund the research?
From Bloomington. Jenna Rosenberg. Jenna, is that you? Jenna? Welcome.
I got it.
Hi, Congressman. My name is Jenna Rosenberg. I want to mention to you, you mentioned Charlottesville and called it that thing that happened in Charlottesville, and you said you spoke out against it. Congressman, I sat in front of you in your office and asked you if you would sign on to censure the president, and you pretended like you didn't, you said you didn't even know about it, that there was a call to censure.
What's your question, please?
So that my question is, following up on the previous conversation here, will you fund the research to make sure, will you commit today to funding the research in budgets to make sure we understand what can be done to fix the gun violence issue in this country? This is a yes or no answer. Are you going to commit to doing it?
So yes, I want to see that funded. And then secondly, I was not aware of having the censure resolution. So
well,
no.
You
but I remember meeting
out.
with you several times. So
no, I've only met with you once, sir.
Very much in my
from
office,
Plymouth.
so.
We have. I think is it Kristen or Kristen Christofferson? Kristen, right here.
Hi, Congressman. We went to college together, so I know that you are a smart enough guy to understand climate change and the science behind it. I'm concerned that Scott Pruitt and the Environmental Protection Agency are being decimated. He is decimating the agency's work to to regulate, to keep the clean, pristine waters and air that we have here in Minnesota. I'd like to know why you haven't stood up to what they're doing.
Well, I have stood up on a number of fronts. Number one, Boundary Waters Canoe Area. And I don't know how many of you have frequently gone there or visited there. I think it is Minnesota's Yellowstone. And protecting it from a conservationist perspective as well as mineral mining, et cetera, you should have all of the scientific research that backs up and allowing you to have a balanced approach, with jobs, et cetera, that area wants, right? And I think that's appropriate. Now, I'm opposite of where the administration is and some of my colleagues, Republican colleagues on that front. So as far as the EPA goes, I'm not aware of anything specific where they're gutting anything or changing things, because we do appropriations. But maybe you have I don't know if you have a certain policy that has changed that you didn't like, for instance, but,
Do you read the news?
Pruitt's got other issues too, so.
Okay, we're at 60 minutes, and I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, we can do a couple more.
Okay, from Chanhassen, Abigail Nichols. Abigail, are you here? Here she is, right here.
First of all, I want to thank you for doing this town hall today. I'm currently a college student, and I'm looking at facing a lot of student debt once I graduate. And with the amount of student debt at an all-time high in our country, it's almost $1 trillion. I want to know what you're doing to try and make college more accessible to a lot of students.
Well, it's a question we've been hearing a lot about from a lot of students in particular. So I think what has to change is sort of the model that has been in place for a long period of time, where you get federal aid, you get student loans, and then your tuition just keeps going up higher and higher anyway. So the New York Federal Reserve has done studies on this, and they've shown that for every dollar that's given in student loans and financial aid, and Pell Grants, your tuition is going up 65 cents on the dollar or 50 cents on the dollar. So that's where the model is sort of broken internally within the administration side of higher education, right? So I think some of the things that at the federal level we should be looking at are income share, what's that called? Income share agreements, where it's essentially an equity option, where instead of just getting a traditional loan from the government or a bank, for instance, you would have a company invest in you as a student for your future and pay a percentage of wherever you decide to work. You may want to teach or be an AmeriCorps, or you may be an entrepreneur and go into business, but your percentage would be what you have promised to, give back as a part of them, investing in you. And it's been started and is being used, and I've been working with some folks, with some investors that are interested in this concept. There's some legislation now that's been drafted on it that is moving forward, and it hasn't sort of been ripe where we've had votes on it, for instance, but I think that's sort of a different model that we need to look at, and probably getting some of the higher education institutions behind it. By the way, when the tax reform discussion was going on, I was meeting frequently with all of our local Minnesota colleges, and the University of Minnesota, by the way, that were concerned about some changes that would have impacted their graduate education programs, tuition programs that are existent. And so I was able to, essentially move that in a different direction. And we kept and restored all those provisions, which I think are very important for young people like yourself and others at these institutions. So just...
Okay. We have time for one more. From Minnetonka, is Jacob Davis still here? Jacob? There we go.
Last chance in 7 years, make it worth it.
What's your question?
I'm going to close the loop on healthcare one last time, if you all don't mind. In 1948, the World Health Organization formed with the following excerpts from their Constitution. The enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one fundamental right of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic, or social condition. And also, governments have a responsibility for the health of their peoples, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate health and social measures. Congressman, do you agree with these founding principles of the WHO? If not, can you explain to us why not? If so, can you explain why your yea vote for the AHCA, which stands starkly opposed to those principles?
Well, I'll say this is that we've got the best health care in the world, but it's too expensive.
Was it yes or no?
Too expensive. So I would just say this is
Please,
that
respect
for these,
Congressman.
for these folks who have an insurance card but no coverage, it's a real travesty. And there are no easy answers, right? But the one-size-fits-all approach is not working. I don't have a problem with young people being on their parents' policy. I don't have a problem with limiting the caps, taking away those caps that were on insurance. And I've talked to a lot of folks that have benefited under that, for instance. But making sure you get the right access to healthcare is important because emergency hospital visits haven't gone down. I mean, that's where the expense has been, in terms of healthcare. I think it has to be more of a focus on coordinated care and chronic care management. And so I've actually, this is in the Medicare space, but I've teamed up with Ron Wyden, who's a pretty liberal Democrat, and one House member and one other senator. And it's our little gang of four where we have a proposal for coordinated care within Medicare so that the physician is talking to the specialist, is talking to the pharmacist, et cetera, and they're all coordinating the care. And if the patient does better, they get rewarded and reimbursed a little bit more. But if they don't do better and they don't hit benchmarks, guess what? They don't get the reimbursements of just regular fee for service because that's what's driving the costs up so much for everybody. So I think that model just has to be used a little bit broader. And then chronic care management, coordinated care. So 68% of all Medicare beneficiaries have 2 or more chronic conditions now. And that's where 93% of Medicare costs are going, as an example. So you do some progress in that area. You can do other things in medical liability reform and selling insurance across state lines and more competition. That's sort of on the broader healthcare side. Some healthcare savings account expansion. But all those things added together can make a difference. Associated health plans, we allow people to pool together. So smaller companies and realtors and others can actually leverage their small business getting together with others so they can have the same leverage as a large company, for instance, to cover themselves or their employees and spread the risk out is a good answer too. Yeah. So access is important. And that's
So Congressman, I just want to say thank you to all of you that were invited to ask a question, your thoughtful questions, and thank you to all of you for respectfully respecting and enjoying one another. So thank you very much.
When will we do this again? When's the next one?